So picture this. It's the early 20th century, and for the British Empire in India, the clock is ticking. The calls for self-rule are getting louder and louder, and that forces a really tough question. Today, we're diving into two huge reforms, one in 1909 and another in 1919, that were Britain's big answer to that very question.
And that, right there, is the central puzzle. How do you give people a voice, maybe a little bit of power, just enough to keep them on your side, without actually giving up control? It's like walking a tightrope, and that incredible balancing act is the absolute key to understanding both of these reforms.
So, you gotta ask, why then? What was happening that made these reforms so necessary? Well, the start of the 20th century in India was basically a powder keg. These changes weren't some generous gift from the British, they were concessions made under immense pressure from all sides.
You can just look at this timeline and feel the pressure building. First, some earlier, pretty minor reforms had failed, which just left everyone frustrated. Then, bam, the decision to partition Bengal in 1905 acts like a spark to dry tinder. Suddenly, the Indian National Congress is demanding home rule. And right at that exact moment, you have the Simla deputation asking the Viceroy, Lord Minto, for something very specific and very new: separate voting for Muslims. It was truly a perfect storm of pressure.
So yeah, the British had to do something. Their answer was the Indian Councils Act of 1909, what we now call the Minto-Morley Reforms. The whole strategy was to release just a little bit of pressure from this political steam valve. The thinking was, if they increased Indian participation, maybe they could placate the moderates and at the same time win over the Muslim community.
So what did these reforms actually do? Well, for starters, they expanded the legislative councils, which meant more seats for Indians. And in a really historic first, an Indian, Satyendra Pal Sinha, was brought into the Viceroy's Executive Council. We're talking the real center of power here. Council members could also now debate the budget. These were all definitely steps forward. But it's that last point on the list that would have the most lasting and frankly the most controversial impact.
The Act introduced this idea of a separate electorate. Let's be super clear on what this means, because it's crucial. It set up a system where, in certain constituencies, only Muslims could vote for Muslim candidates. This wasn't just about reserving a few seats. This was about creating a completely separate political path based entirely on religious identity.
And you can see the long-term consequence right there. By literally writing religious division into the law, the Act, as many saw it, legalized communalism. And this is exactly why Lord Minto is often called the father of the communal electorate. It was a decision that would cast a very, very long shadow.
But here's the thing. Letting out a little bit of steam just wasn't enough. A decade later, with World War I completely changing the global map and the Home Rule movement pushing harder than ever, Britain tried again. This time with a much more ambitious plan, the Government of India Act of 1919. And right at its heart was a complex new idea.
And that system was called diarchy. What it means basically is a dual government for the provinces. All the administrative responsibilities were split into two separate lists. One that would be controlled by Indian ministers, and another that would be kept firmly under British control.
This table shows you exactly how that split worked in practice. Just look at the two columns. Indian ministers got what were called transferred subjects, things like local government and sanitation. Important stuff for sure. But then look at what the British governor kept for himself: police, justice, and most importantly, the money. So in effect, Indian ministers were given responsibility, but not the real power.
Now, the 1919 Act didn't stop with diarchy. It also created a two-house legislature at the center. And remember those separate electorates? Well, the Act doubled down on that idea, extending it beyond just Muslims to include Sikhs, Europeans, and Anglo-Indians. And for the very first time, a tiny fraction of the population, including some women, finally got the right to vote.
Okay, so after two massive reform acts, what's the verdict? Were these genuine steps towards self-rule, or was it something else entirely? Let's break down the gains versus the very real limitations.
This slide really sums it all up, doesn't it? On the plus side, you had more Indians in government than ever before. For the first time, self-government was an official, stated goal, and they could now openly criticize the executive. But then you look at the downside. The seed of communalism was now a core, legal part of the system. The governor could veto anything he wanted, there was no real control over the budget, and those new provincial ministers could be overruled whenever the governor felt like it.
So this is the crucial point. This is the fine print.
Even with all the new councils and all the new Indian members, the final say, the ultimate power, always rested with the British. The Governor-General could push through any law he wanted, with or without the legislature's approval. It was representation, sure, but without the final authority.
So when all the dust settles, what is the legacy of these two landmark acts? Well, it's a story of contradiction. It's about giving with one hand while holding back, or in some cases taking away, with the other.
So in the end, these reforms really did open a door. More Indians could now participate in their own governance, and that was a door that could never be fully closed again. But the price of entry was incredibly high. The whole system was now designed to build walls between communities, making religious identity the most important factor in politics.
Which leaves us with this one big question. Were these reforms a genuine, if really flawed, step toward Indian freedom? Or were they something else, a masterclass in the strategy of divide and rule, designed to keep control by splitting the very people the British claimed they were empowering? That is the complicated, messy legacy they left behind.